Welcome, guys, to a very special episode of the Followers of the Force podcast. Today I'm joined by Academy Award-winning editor Paul Hirsch. You may know his work from Mission Impossible, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, a personal favorite of mine, and obviously many more films, including Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. So first, Paul, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So before we get into talking about Star Wars, I wanted to ask you, how did the idea for the book come about?
I was on location in Vancouver in 1999, and my wife had not accompanied me on location. When I go on location, I have a job, I have a place to go every day, I have people I see regularly. When my wife accompanies me, she has no friends in this strange town. She has no job. She has no place to go. So it's a very unhappy situation for her. So we decided that, I would just go. And I found myself alone in Vancouver on the weekends. And I'd been telling stories, when I'd go visit the set from time to time. Usually I'm too busy to do that, but occasionally I like to take a break and go chit chat with the actors and so forth, and talk with the DP or whoever's available. And I would tell these stories about things that had happened to me, and I was having some success of telling them. And I thought to myself, I should really write these stories down.
Right.
And I was on the weekend. I was alone. I had nothing to do, so I started writing down some of my war stories. Mm-hmm. And I had no intention of writing a book at that point, but after I had written one chapter, I thought, maybe this would make a potential book someday. So I made an outline for myself of the pictures I'd worked on, the people I'd worked with, some of the more colorful stories that I could remember, and it was very smart for me to make this outline, because if I started today to try to write the book, I wouldn't remember anything. But
right.
But I had made this outline for myself, the things I wanted to talk about, some of the aesthetic problems we faced and how we solved them, and as well as the anecdotal stuff. And that was it. And I started, whenever I had a free period. Some time off between jobs, I would go back to the outline, pick another section, and write about that. And I chipped for 18 years, and I finished. Well, eventually the periods between jobs got longer.
Right.
This is why they call it a career arc, because whatever goes up must come down.
Right.
So, so as I got older, I was getting, longer stretches of unemployment in between jobs. So I got the chance to work on the book more. And then I finished the first draft in about summer of, I think it was 2017.
Okay. And while you were writing it and get all of these stories together, how did it feel sort of reliving all of these moments again, writing the book?
Well, it's just, I was just relating as if I was talking to a friend and relating what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And then, occasionally I'd feel the need to explain myself. But I wasn't trying to write a how-to book.
Right.
I think books about, textbooks are very boring, and I didn't want to write a boring book. My intention was to share these stories of things that I thought they were pretty good stories, and I thought they were entertaining. And, and if you learn something at the same time, occasionally I find myself needing to explain something or other just so that people could follow the narrative,
Right.
So I guess there's some wisdom to be gleaned, I suppose. And it was also sort of a narration of how I started out knowing nothing and how I picked up whatever I know on the way.
Right. And
I cut my first feature knowing nothing, absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And I didn't know, I didn't know I knew nothing, which was a great advantage because, I was operating without a net and I didn't know there was no net below me, So
right.
I was fully confident. My confidence was based on ignorance.
It's funny you mentioned, it being sort of a narrative, and you really do bring these stories to life, and it always felt like I was standing right there beside you, whether you were cutting a film, whether you were talking to Brian De Palmas or somebody else. And I have to ask you, one of the most fascinating relationships that you talked about was yours with Bernard Herrmann, and
Yeah,
when you were talking about the one where he like blew up on you for something you didn't even do in the
yeah.
editing room, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm here. Um, but
I
can you
had to
talk a
open
little
my
bit?
mouth.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about him and how what it was like working with him? Because he seems like such a larger than life sort of figure.
Oh, he definitely was. I mean, I think he's the most unforgettable person I've ever met.
Yeah.
Um, Up there, yeah, I mean, there's others up there with him, but
Mm,
he's definitely larger than life.
yeah.
Uh, I think of somebody like Tom Cruise, in that category.
Hmm.
And yeah, powerful personality. And when you read it, you don't really capture the full flavor of his rage, because
Yeah.
when he yelled, he really yelled. I mean,
Hmm.
um, and Brian and I used to do impressions of him, but we had to stop after a few seconds because it would destroy our vocal cords.
Oh
Because
my gosh.
he really let rip, top of his voice.
Right.
So when he yelled at you, you felt it. I mean, it
Yeah.
was, but it was just a misunderstanding. And um, I talk about how, as a result, on the first picture we did together, Sisters, I
Hmm.
became the whipping boy. I couldn't say anything that he'd approve of. Anything I
Right.
suggested, he would say, no, 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 no. And then I'd whisper it to Brian, and he would suggest it, and he'd say, yeah, okay, let's try that.
Right.
So I was just persona non grata, and the irony was that I hadn't said a word when he had called out. Anyway, I go into this in detail in the book,
Hmm.
but he thought I had said something when I hadn't, and he just blew up. So um,
Yeah.
I was crushed because it had been my putting his music into the picture in the first place that resulted in him being hired.
Hmm.
So excuse me. And then a few years, 2 or 3 years later, when he came on to the second picture I did with him, Obsession, I didn't know what to expect. And when he saw me, he greeted me with Paul, my boy, how are you? It's so good to see you.
Right.
And I was just blown away but apparently he had read this article that Brian had written in the interim that was published in Village Voice
Hmm.
about how it had been my putting the music in as temp music that had given Brian the idea of hiring Benny in the first place. So, um, and it was also um, Sisters that brought him back to the attention of contemporary directors.
Hmm.
Yeah, Marty Scorsese suddenly thought, "Oh, I got to get Benny for my picture."
Yeah.
So it was kind of a knock-on effect, and it sort of revived his career. We didn't realize how close to the end he was.
Right.
Uh, he was only 64 when he died.
Hmm.
When I met him, I was 26. I thought he was the oldest person I'd ever met in my life. He seemed ancient. Now I'm 10 years older than he was.
Right. Yeah. It was
Yeah,
really it
yeah.
was really a great part of the book, albeit in the beginning of the book, but it just how that relationship sort of evolved, and it was really cool to see. But now fast forward to Star Wars, and I know that you've mentioned this or you've talked about this story on other podcasts, and you go into it in detail in the book. But for listeners who haven't heard the story and have no idea how you got involved with it, how did you get involved with Star Wars?
Well, it's sort of a complicated, long tale.
Hmm.
Brian and George had been working on the Warner Brothers lot in 1971.
Hmm.
Brian was directing a picture called Get to Know Your Rabbit, from
Hmm.
which he eventually got fired. And George was directing THX 1138. And they became friends because they were the youngest directors on the lot. Excuse me. And I think they were the only directors at the time who had beards. That was a thing, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s. So it was, so they met and they became friends. And then Brian's pictures came to George's attention. And then when we did Phantom of the Paradise a few years later, there was a screening of the picture in L.A. and I was there. I came out. I was still living in New York in those days, and I flew out to L.A. and I was introduced to Marcia and George. Marcia Lucas was married to George at the time. She was a film editor who had worked with Scorsese, and they liked my work in Phantom of the Paradise. So she grabbed me by the hand and pulled me through the crowd at the party and introduced me to George. And so that was my initial meeting with him. And then a couple of years later, the following year, I guess it was, Marty was doing Taxi Driver, and they got in some schedule problems and needed more help. And Marcia called and said, "Can you come out and work on Taxi Driver? Because you know Benny, and it would be a great help to have you on the picture." And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And she called back the next day. She said the studio wouldn't allow it. You know, they're not going to bring somebody out from New York. There are enough great editors out here, and they don't want to pay per diem and travel and all that stuff. You know, so I said, okay. You know, that was that. And then I went on and edited. I was hired by Brian to cut Carrie. Now, Carrie and happened around the same time that George was prepping Star Wars. And both Brian and George were looking for actors in the same age range. So they decided to have their casting calls together. So, they had these cattle calls. All the young actors in Hollywood would show up and audition for Brian and George. And while they were taking a break from casting one day, Brian called me. He said, "Here, George wants to speak to you." And he put George on the phone, and George said, I really like your work, and I'd like to work with you someday. I've already got an editor for this next picture I'm doing, but I'm going to do one, after that. And, so I said, great, and I went home and I told my wife, I said, George says he wants to work with me, which is terrific, except I'd really like to work on the picture he's prepping now. Yeah. It sounds great. And all I knew about it was the title, Star Wars. And at that time, space movies had always been about going to the moon or going to Mars or, somewhere in the solar system. The idea of Star Wars, like really far away, was really kind of captivating and exciting to me. So anyway, I couldn't do it, and that was that. So I was editing Carrie, and during this time I went to a friend's house in New York, a man named Jay Cox, who's a screenwriter now, and he was friends with, he had been a Time magazine movie critic, and he'd been over to visit George on the set of Star Wars in England, and he came back with a book of production stills, and I saw these stills at his house, and they showed, the stormtroopers and the sandcrawler and the Jawas and R2 and 3PO and Chewbacca, and I got really excited about the images. I still didn't know what the story was or anything, but just these images were so fantastic. And we went home that night. I said to my wife again, I said, "Boy, I know George wants to work with me someday, but I really wish it could have been. I wish it could have been this one, Right. So anyway, fast forward, they finished the shooting. Marcia and George come back from England through where they'd been shooting, through New York. We screened Carrie for them, and about a week or two later, I got a phone call from Marcia saying, essentially the same story as on Taxi Driver. We've got a lot of work to do. They had fired the editor when they left England. They weren't happy with the cut at all. Right. And Marcia and Richard Chu, who had been hired in California, were recutting the picture, and they realized they were going to need more help because it was just too much work. So she called again, and she said, "How would you like to come work on the picture. Now, my wife was 1 month pregnant at the time.
Right.
And I thought, well, how can I leave her when she's just become pregnant, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I said to Marsha, I said, listen, I have to talk to my wife and I'll get back to you. And then I hung up, and then Brian overheard this and he said, what was that? I said, Marsha wants me to come work on Star Wars. And I had said to Marsha, I said, hey, am I going to get a call tomorrow saying the studio turned, said I could do it? And she said, no, this is very different. George is in charge, and it's not going to be like that,
Right.
So I said, well, let me talk to my wife. So then Brian heard that. He said, you don't call her back. And he says, what's her number? And he calls her back, and he says, he'll do it.
Right.
And he says, and then he worked it out with her, and he even negotiated my rate. And then he got off the phone. He says, work it out with James. You don't tell her you don't tell Marsha your problems.
Mm-hmm.
You work it out with her. So I went home and I said, honey, I got this offer. It's just, that picture that I was talking about, they want me on it,
Mm-hmm.
And she said, do it. So that was it. So then I finished Carrie the end of September. And then Marsha and Richard and I worked on the picture together as a trio
Mm-hmm.
for October, November, December. And I was hired to the end of the year. And toward the end of December, Marsha came to me and she said, Marty Scorsese has been is cutting his picture in New York with Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli. And his editor died. And he wants me to come down to LA and take over the picture. I said, oh, I didn't know. And she said, and George has decided he wants to finish the picture with just one editor. And I assumed because Richard had been hired before me,
Mm-hmm.
that she was going to tell me that, thank you very much, goodbye and good luck,
Right.
And instead she said, he wants it to be you. And I was surprised because I didn't know that Richard had been hired on the same basis as me. It was only till the end of the year.
Right.
So at that point, George chose me, and then I was the editor for the rest of the schedule, January, February through mid-May.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I was the fourth editor hired on the picture, I wound up putting in more months than anyone else, so they gave me first credit on the film. And I guess I answered more than your question there.
Oh, no, that was great. I was going to ask you, when you arrived to start cutting the movie, I know that there were all these issues during production with, the visual effects shots not coming in. They were going over budget and all these different issues, and George's health becoming an issue. Do you remember what the atmosphere was like when you got there in the fall of '76?
Well, everyone was very busy. That was the atmosphere was just a lot of, everyone's very busy.
Mm-hmm.
Time to sit around and chit chat, it was
right.
like everyone was hard at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was coming in, the train was already traveling at full speed when I got on.
Right.
So George was flying down to Los Angeles every Monday morning. He'd spend 3 days at ILM. And Wednesday night, he would fly back up to San Francisco and then come into the editing room Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And then he'd take a day off on Sunday, and then Monday to go back down to ILM. So that was what he was doing. And, and Richard was recutting the picture. I was recutting the picture, and we were sort of leapfrogging over each other. When he finished the reel, I'd go on to the next one and vice versa.
Right.
And Marsha was deep into the end battle, just building it, putting it together. It was a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
So at a certain point, they had to get it done in order for ILM to be able to finish it on time. And I jumped in and helped Marsha do the end of the end battle.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was very busy, and I get asked all the time, "Did you know that it was going to turn out to be?" And, we weren't thinking in those terms. We were just. I remember seeing an ad they were going to put out at Christmas, and it said, "Coming this summer, coming to a galaxy near you this summer in 6-track stereophonic sound with 70 millimeter." And I thought, oh my God, because I'd just been cutting 16 millimeter a few years before.
Right.
The idea the idea of me working on a big, Hollywood presentation like that, it was just sort of mind blowing.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, obviously Star Wars was something completely different in terms of the story and the visuals and all that sort of stuff than what you had worked on previously. But what was it like once you were the sole editor beginning in the new year in 77? What was it like working with George side by side, sort of making these decisions on cuts and little things to change here and there?
Well, it's just normal, that's the way editors and directors collaborate. Somebody gets an idea, and, by the end of the day, you don't remember whose idea it was. You're just
Right.
working together trying to solve problems. And, he'd say, I have a problem with this. And then I'd say, I have a problem with this. And we'd talk about it and figure out how to solve it, So
Mm-hmm.
it's just a normal procedure,
Yeah.
During that period, we were doing a lot of reshooting as well. It was kind of, our task was not only cutting the picture, but trying to understand what material we needed to really maximize the effect, and what was lacking and what we could pick up, and, how we'd use it and so forth. So it wasn't purely cutting.
Mm-hmm. You also go in really cool detail about some of the decisions that you guys made during the film. One of them was, changing the lightsaber colors. Vader was supposed to have the blue one, Luke was supposed to have the red one, and also the moving around the chronology of the message scene from Leia. How it was
Right.
supposed to be the message first, and then Obi-Wan and Luke would just sort of talk and forget that was kind of happening.
Right.
Do you remember, like, any one specific, aside from those two, any specific change that you felt really elevated the movie?
Well, I also wrote about this in the book, which is the early scenes with Luke Skywalker we removed. There
Yeah.
were some scenes before the robot auction, where we meet Luke currently in the film.
Mm-hmm.
There were scenes of him watching the battle in the sky from the surface of the planet.
Right.
And the scenes were not strong scenes. The performances were not terribly strong. The locations were sort of enigmatic and ambiguous, and Toshi Power Station was supposed to be a teen hangout, but how do you know? I mean, how do we? Anyway, so and there were other problems with Luke is talking to his friend Biggs, who's wearing a cape, and it was a very windy day, and some shots the cape is blowing in this direction, and some shots it's blowing in this direction. And you couldn't cut from this shot to this shot, and I thought, what? And then I'm listening to what they're talking about, and I thought, what is this? This is all, we're going to find this all out later. We don't need any of this stuff,
Right.
So I said to George, why don't we just lose all this stuff?
Yeah.
So we took it out, and then we discovered the added benefit was that when 3PO and R2 land on Tatooine, we don't know that it's inhabited. We don't know who's living on the planet. We don't know there are humans down there.
Mm-hmm.
The first sign of life that we see is a big dinosaur skeleton.
Right.
So, and then the first creatures we meet are all droids inside the, after the Jawas, he wakes up in this, 3PO wakes up in the belly of the sandcrawler, and they're surrounded by all these fantastic looking droids of all kinds,
Right.
It was just very exciting for me, actually, but anyway, the added benefit was it made the planet more mysterious, and it made Luke's entrance into the film more organic. Than we arrived at him by following the journey of R2 and 3PO.
Right.
From the battle down to the planet and so forth.
Right. And you talk about it being exciting to obviously work on the film, but also seeing all these different, droids, the aliens in the cantina. And I imagine cutting the movie as a whole, at some point you had to sort of step back and be like, wow, this is something I'd never seen before. And I can't wait until this is all put together with obviously John Williams' score, Ben Burtt's sound design, all that stuff. So once you had that final cut, do you remember like your initial thoughts of what you thought when you saw it?
Well, here's the thing about working on movies,
Hmm.
which is that when you finally solve all the problems and you put every little finishing detail on the film, and
Yeah.
you've corrected the color and you got the sound mix just right, and everything is perfect, and you're not going to make a single more change.
Hmm.
To me, it's as if the movie uh, is dead. It's embalmed. When I'm
Right.
working, it's a living, breathing thing. I can push and pull. You can add this, take away that. You can affect this, increase this, diminish this. But once it's set, it's
Hmm.
no longer a living, breathing creature, and it's just, for me, it's I can't look at it anymore. It's just it loses its life, you know.
Right.
And also by that time, I've seen it so many times that I think
Yeah.
if I watch it one more time, I'd put my eyes out, you know. So so it's what I call a sort of a Faustian bargain. You get to be in on the creation, but you
Hmm.
can't really enjoy the fruits of your labor because you've overwatched it so much, you know.
Right. Right. Yeah, I totally understand that.
Moses leading the people to the
Yeah.
promised land. You can bring them there, but you can't go in yourself, you know.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
so, but as the years go by and you go back to it, you can get some distance from it. Then it's a different story. I mean, I had a recent experience watching Planes, Trains, Automobiles in Chicago in a packed theater, and that was fantastic because, as I say, when the picture first came out, I couldn't stand to look at it anymore, and I never had the experience of watching it and enjoying it with a full house of people really roaring at the jokes.
Right. Right.
When I experienced that after, what was it, 30 something years,
Hmm.
had gone by, it was a fantastic experience, one of the great screenings of my entire life.
Yeah.
So the screenings that come later, as I've discovered that, the 30th, 40th anniversary screenings of things tend to be more fun because you've forgotten the film by then. And
Right. Right.
it regains some of the freshness that it has for audiences in the first place. But
Right.
when you first finish a film, you never want to see it again.
Hmm.
You've had it, and
Yeah.
like I say, it's no longer something you can engage with.
Right. Um, so you obviously you've finished the movie at this point, even going through some really weird, almost decisions that the studio made, and one of them was eliminating the entire Death Star assault altogether.
Yeah,
Which when
yeah,
I read that, I was like, how could you do that? That's such a great part of the movie. Can you talk a little bit about you know that decision, and what was your reaction to first hearing that?
well, I thought it was absurd.
Yeah.
And so did George. I mean, we all thought, what are they thinking? But uh, all the executives are always making these calculations about uh, if I spend this much on the picture, it'll
Hmm.
make money. But if I spend a little more, it won't make money. So it's like I've been involved in pictures where like they were bidding for an actor, and then Will Smith wants $8 million. Well, we're only willing to pay him 6.
Hmm.
And I think to myself, what does that mean? What's the difference if you pay him 6 or 8? You can have Will Smith in your movie.
Yeah.
And they make these decisions that this is worth it, but this is not. I don't know how they arrived at these things. So,
Right.
clearly they thought, well, we don't want to spend too much money on this movie. So if we cut the end battle, we'll have spent less and we'll be more likely to make money.
Hmm.
That was the thinking. That can only be the thinking. I mean,
Right.
it's not an aesthetic choice. They're not sitting there saying, "Oh, I think it would be a better picture if they didn't have the end battle."
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
that's not how they're thinking. They're thinking, the clock is running and we're running out of money, and why don't we just eliminate that and we'll be okay.
Right. Right. And it's amazing to sort of then go back and listen to George talk about studios meddling in THX, meddling in American Graffiti, and then they're once again trying to do it with Star Wars. Um, but
Yeah,
luckily, everything turns out sort of the best way it could. And I know George said that I think there was a quote where he said the movie is 25% of what I wanted it to be at the time.
uh-huh.
Um, but even then, it's fantastic film. And then obviously it comes out. in May of '77 and completely changes the world. Um, and then right after that, you also mentioned that it was the best test screening you've ever been to. The crowd just went absolutely nuts.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, when did you sort of know, one, that George was already planning a sequel, and how did you get on to work on Empire Strikes Back?
Well, I didn't hear about the sequel until the following winter. I was in LA for the Academy Awards,
Right.
and I went to lunch with Gary Kurtz, and he said, "How would you like to work on the sequel?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm in."
Mm-hmm.
So that was it, and there was no way I was going to, not work on the picture.
Right.
So he said, "Well, we're going to start in about a year or 2 years." I forget. Well, let me think of that. That was '78. We're going to start in a year from now, he said.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and one of the cool things that you talk about as well, I mean, we'll get back to Empire in just a second, but that you're receiving merchandise from the films from Gary for like
yeah,
a little bit. And do you remember sort of some of your favorite items that you got?
yeah. Well, what happened was he walked in one day with a baseball cap
Yeah.
and said Star Wars on it. I said, "I want one." I said, "Okay." And then he came in another day, and I said he had a mug or something. I said, "I want one of those.
Right.
I want one of everything." He said, "Okay." I didn't know what I was asking for. So when the picture came out, they hadn't produced any toys. They didn't know what the demand would be,
Yeah.
and the demand was huge. The following Christmas, they were giving out coupons to be redeemed for the toy because they hadn't made the toys yet. So
Right.
you get a empty box with a coupon inside. So then a few months later, I got this carton. It was about 3 feet high, about 2 feet square, and it was crammed with uh, toys and games and stuff. And of course, had young kids at the time, so everything
Right.
got torn open and played with. So, um,
Yeah.
but I managed to preserve. And then, of course, my wife was cleaning up one time, and she threw away a lot of this stuff.
Oh no.
So, but I managed to preserve some, a few things.
Oh, that's great. That
They're all
was
beat
a
up.
really,
They don't
yeah,
mean anything to anyone because they're all beat up and used. But
yeah. No, yeah, it's a great memory of that time, and obviously those Star Wars toys back then, and then going up until today. I mean, they're priceless at this point. So that was a really cool part of the book because I really related to that. Anytime a new movie came out, I'm like, all right, I got to get that figure, I got to get this. So I totally get it.
And I
Um,
got these cartons every 6 months for a couple of years. I mean, it
yeah.
just went on and on.
That's amazing. I wish I'd be so fortunate to have that happen. Um, but going back to Empire,
Yeah,
obviously this time you had the fortune of being able to work on the film right from the get-go,
right.
and you didn't have to sort of restore everything back to dailies and sort of cut it as if it was the first initial cut. So can you talk a little bit about the difference of working on Empire versus Star Wars, whether it was a little more challenging or whether, just how the whole production was different?
Well, I was working with a different director, first of
Hmm.
all.
Yeah.
Uh, George had hired Irvin Kershner to direct the picture, and Kirsch had directed a sequel earlier called The Return of the Man Called Horse
Hmm.
with Richard Harris. And um, it was, the sequel was great. So George figured, well, he could do that sequel, he can do my sequel. And Kirsch was excited about it because Star Wars had been what it had been.
Right.
And Kirsch was, a veteran director who had um, a great eye and worked with the actors in ways that George hadn't. George's strengths are in other directions.
Hmm.
But yeah, so working with Kirsch was new, and the the picture wasn't challenging from an aesthetic standpoint. The script was very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Kirsch shot the script, and it wasn't, what made it tricky was that Kirsch started going over schedule right away.
Mm-hmm.
So after been in England for about a week, we're supposed to be there for 16 weeks. We're going to be, I think we got there in February. We're going to be leaving in the middle of June, and then Gary, after a week, Gary said, "Well, I think we're going to be going home a week later than originally planned." And then a week after that, he says, "Well, I think we're going to be going 2 weeks later than that."
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Yeah.
the horizon kept stretching further and further.
Right.
The longer we shot, the further behind we got.
Yeah.
So the original schedule was 16 weeks. Kirsch wound up shooting for 29. So they went 13 weeks over schedule.
Right.
And that time had to come out of the post schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, the picture was really, the script was really good, and Kirsch shot the script, and we were able to lock the picture 1 month after the end of principal photography, and we made all our dates subsequently. So
Mm-hmm.
it really came together rather effortlessly.
Yeah. And you also talk about the script being bold and that it easily could have backfired.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what was it about the script that you thought, man, this could either go really well or it could not go that well?
Yeah, well, your first instinct when you do have a hit like this is to put out a sequel. It's going to be just like it.
Yeah.
We'll have some exciting scene in the beginning, and then we'll have something, exciting in the middle, like the cantina sequence, and then we'll end with a big battle at the end, like we had before, and they'll come out successfully, and our heroes will carry the day. And I read the script, and it's not like that at all. They have the big battle scene at the beginning of the movie, and then it ends on an ambiguous note. What's going to happen? There's a lot of storylines left open. And it was clearly meant to be Act 2 of a 3-act drama.
Right.
And we knew that it takes 3 years to make one of these movies. So how is the audience going to feel when they get to the end of the picture and they realize they're going to have to wait 3 more years to find out what happens next?
Right.
So that was a dangerous thing. And in fact, Empire made less money than Star Wars, and it made less money than Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
Both of which had a very positive, triumphant ending.
Right.
Empire has this sort of ambiguous ending. Luke has lost his hand. He's discovered that his father is Darth Vader, of all people.
Right.
And they're adrift in space. They're not on any planet when we leave them, So it was a very, bold and courageous choice.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the reveal that Vader is Luke's father. Do you remember cutting that scene specifically? And if I remember correctly, the original line, later dubbed over by James Earl Jones, was "Obi-Wan killed your father." And is that what you heard when you were cutting the movie, or were you in on the secret?
Okay, well, to tell you the truth, I don't remember.
Okay.
What I do remember is that when they shot that sequence with Luke out on that mast, or whatever you want to call it,
right?
They had these enormous wind machines that were like giant fans. They were like airplane propellers, maybe 8 feet in diameter, inside cages.
Yeah.
And they were powered by internal combustion engines. So they would start the fans, and there's this roar of noise.
Mm-hmm.
And the noise of the fans was so loud that they didn't even bother recording dialogue.
Okay.
Because you couldn't hear anything.
Right.
So, and of course Vader, you can't see his lips. He's in a mask, so it doesn't matter. Luke had to play the scene, and then Mark had to loop the lines later by lip reading, because we didn't have any guide track. So And I've always felt that, when I see it, all I can think about is that the sync is kind of a little dicey,
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
didn't have a guide track. No, I'll never join you. Or, I always cringe a little when at the lip movements because I think, is it really right? It doesn't seem
Right.
quite.
Right.
So that's what I was thinking about, and I wasn't paying attention so much to what lines were being said.
Mm-hmm.
I went back and I looked at my script recently because this has come up,
Yeah.
and I thought, what did they say? I didn't remember, and I went back and looked at my script, and in my script, that page is missing.
Sneaky George.
And the script is bound, and I never unbound it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It was bound that way.
Right.
So he just left out that page.
Gotcha. Yeah,
So I
because that's
don't.
a story that's a story that's always talked about, whether it's from Mark Hamill or George, and then Mark always tells the story of in the screening, Harrison leans over to him and he's like, "You didn't tell me that." So that's always a really cool story to hear. And another thing I was curious about was that you mentioned that Yoda initially was being taken in a strange direction. And I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about what that strange direction was before we eventually got the Yoda that we know now.
Tell you the truth, I don't really remember, but I think
Okay.
he started looking more and more like Kirsch.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's funny.
But I could be
That's
wrong
funny.
about that. It's
Yeah.
a long time ago. It's a long time
Okay.
ago.
Gotcha. Understood. Um, so obviously, like you said, Empire, the second film in the trilogy, doesn't have necessarily the happiest of endings. But looking back, it's heralded as probably the best Star Wars film in the saga now. Um, but what was the biggest difference between working on Empire and Star Wars? Just taking everything in, story, the the ease of being there on the first day. What was the biggest difference that stood out to you?
They're two totally different experiences.
Yeah.
Well, in one, I was coming in, like I said, as getting on an already moving train
Right.
and having to play catch up and take over eventually. And the other, I was on location in a foreign land and
Hmm.
uh, working on a studio lot, and it was just a totally different experience. And then, of course, I got nominated for an Oscar on Star Wars and won, and on Empire I wasn't nominated at all. So
Yeah.
that was different. It's funny once you win an Oscar, you think, well, on the next picture, you think, well, I worked just as hard on this one,
Yeah.
so I should get an Oscar for this one too.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But it's gratifying to hear that people like the picture so much. I don't I don't really, and I understand why.
Hmm.
People say it's the best one, but I think you have to give all credit to the first one because
Oh yeah.
that's when everything was invented and it was all new and fresh, and also there was a quality of fun to the picture
Hmm.
that started to. I mean, it's still there in Empire, but I think it started to slip away,
Yeah.
uh, the fun aspect of it,
Right.
and it morphed into something, sort of grandiose and
Hmm.
significant, you
Yeah.
know, as opposed to just fun.
Right. Right.
Uh,
And you
but
know.
my take, the
Yeah.
the most interesting take that I've read about Star Wars is that when you watch the movie, you're not watching the movie, you're watching the movies. You're
Hmm.
seeing you're seeing westerns. You're seeing Robin Hood in sword fights in the castle. You're
Right.
seeing Tarzan swinging on a vine. You're seeing World War II fighter pilots. You're seeing uh, Western saloons, the shootout in the bar. You're seeing
Hmm.
like all the movies you've ever seen in Japanese movies with Vader's helmet, and
Yep.
the creature from the Black Lagoon is an influence on the stormtroopers' helmets, and so
Hmm.
you're sort of seeing. It's like George had taken elements of all the movies that he loved and diced them up and tossed them into a new fresh kind of salad. Took all these familiar elements and made them fresh somehow. So I really like that observation.
Right. No, yeah, that's a great one. I never really looked at it that way, but now as I'm replaying the movie in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, all those references are in there, and it
Yeah.
really does make it sort of a complete experience. Um, Now, another thing that I wanted to ask you about was, you mentioned working with Bernard Herrmann, and here in Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, you're working with John Williams. Now, did you have a lot of interaction with John, or was it kind of more of a distant relationship working on Star Wars?
Yeah, well, I wasn't working with him as closely as I did with Benny because,
Mm.
it just was a different situation. John had his own music editor, and he was in LA. We were in Northern California, and we weren't around each other very much. He came to the spotting, and then that's about the only time I met him on the picture. I wasn't able to go to England for the recording.
Right.
I was too busy back in America, and my son was due. Let me think. My daughter. Talking Star Wars, my daughter was due any day, so there's no way I could go to this scoring session.
Right.
It was a question of just proximity. He was in LA, and we were in Northern California, so I didn't get a chance to work with him that much. But I had used a cue from Psycho in the temp track, and John recognized it. Of course, obviously he knew the score, and he was friends with Benny, and Benny had just died a year earlier, so he copied that 3-note theme from Psycho and included it in his version of that cue as a sort of a tip of the hat, an homage to Benny, and it's in the film.
Oh, that's awesome. That is really cool. Yeah, because I was always interested in, because you don't really hear too many like stories about John Williams in terms of being right there with him working on Star Wars. So, but anytime there's a little interview with him, I'm always like, I gotta listen to it because his music is so synonymous with that time and those movies especially.
Well, he's a genius, John.
Yeah.
He's a genius.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a period of I listen to a lot of classical music and always have, and there's a period of musical history, mid 20th century, when composers got carried away with experimenting with 12-tone music, where you have a lot of dissonant kind of music, and the orchestras try to force it down audiences' throats again and again, and the audiences reject it, but here's John Williams writing for the movies, and this is the music that people want to hear. You listen to classical music stations, and they're playing a suite based on Leia's theme from Star Wars.
Right.
It's just beautiful music, and anyway, he's a brilliant composer, and he never runs dry. He's an endless fount of creativity, and I bumped into him in 2004 or 5. I was nominated for Ray, and John was there. I think he'd been nominated I don't know how many times. And I said to him, John, they're going to carve your face on Mount Rushmore one of these days.
Oh, that's funny.
But he's been nominated, 50 times or something? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's
something crazy like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a genius.
I was actually really fortunate. I went to the Star Wars convention back in 2017 here in Orlando, and I guess nobody knew that he was going to be there. But right at the end of the 40th anniversary panel for Star Wars, there's a curtain on the right-hand side of the stage, and it lifts up, and it's him conducting the Orlando Symphony Orchestra, playing the Star Wars theme, playing Leia's theme, and then the Imperial March at the end. So I was there with my dad, and it was an amazing experience because I never thought I'd get to see him conduct an orchestra live. So it's definitely up there in Star Wars related experiences. So that was a really cool moment. And you talk about sort of at the end of the chapter on Star Wars, you mentioned that the experience was as if you were walking along a road and a flying saucer landed next to you. And George said, "Do you
Yeah.
want to come for a ride?" And then you did
Yeah.
it, and you did it again. So, can you talk a little bit about sort of how that really impacted your life working on Star Wars? Aside from the obvious that you won an Oscar and it's the biggest movie of all time in my opinion.
Well, it was a fantastically uh, extraordinary stroke of luck
Yeah.
to get that credit. I was 31 years old. My first child had just been born, and I get Star Wars. I get an
Yeah.
Oscar. It set my career in a powerful direction right from early on. So I mean, I dined off Star Wars for many years. I'm sure, it changed my life for the better,
Yeah.
and continues to. I mean, I wrote this book. I think a lot of people are buying the book just because it's somehow connected to Star Wars, even though it's 8 months out of a 50-year career.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, it's. I'm convinced I'm one of the luckiest people who ever lived.
No, I believe it. I mean, that doesn't happen to too many people. So I would think you're right on that one. And it's a really cool story you talk about later in 2015. J.J. Abrams invites you to watch a cut of The Force Awakens before it comes out.
Yeah.
Do you remember your initial thoughts on the movie and then ultimately reconnecting with George at the premiere?
Yeah, well, when I saw the picture, I thought it was in very good shape. There were a couple of things that were sort of odd. Um, but my notes were just a few. I mean, the picture was in very good shape.
Yeah.
I thought JJ did some wonderful stuff. I mean, essentially, it was a remake of the first one.
Right.
And I loved the idea of these crashed Imperial Star Cruisers lying around the desert like discarded toys. Like
Right.
the broken toys from my children's
Yeah.
play. You know, and then I thought, the blood marked on the helmet of it's not Poe. What's his name?
Finn. Finn.
Finn.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was very smart. The way you identify him. He's the guy. Oh yeah, he's the one that. So
Yeah.
I thought there were really some great visual storytelling touches in it, and I thought it was just wonderful. And after it was over, I bumped into George, and he said, "Boy," he says, "compared to what we were doing, compared to this, we were just playing with paper planes on strings. Seems like."
Yeah.
And then he thanked me. I thanked him. He said, "For what?" I said, "Well, for my career." He said, he said, "Well, you were the last man standing."
Yeah.
So he thanked me too.
That's great. And when you were working on Star Wars, you mentioned just the generosity of from George and Marcia, and then later from Steven Spielberg, sort of letting you and your wife rent out their house and then stay over. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with George and Marcia and sort of just how generous they were while you guys were working together?
Yeah, well, Marcia could. I mean, they couldn't have been nicer to us, and
Yeah.
they didn't rent us their house. Spielberg rented us his house. We had to
Spielberg,
pay.
right. There you
We
go.
had to pay Steven. But no, George and Marcia just said. Marcia said, "Well, we had to move out of our house because it was the end of the month. We
Hmm.
couldn't afford to take it for another month. We were going to be moving down to L.A. and we didn't know what to do." She said, "Well, we're going to England for the scoring. Why don't you move into our house? By the time the baby's born, by the time we come back, the baby will be born, and we'll all be down in L.A." So what happened was the baby was late, and my wife had to have a cesarean. So
Hmm.
George and Marcia came back from England before we were able to move out of there, and because she had had the cesarean, Jane was unable to handle the stairs going up to the guest rooms, which were upstairs. So we stayed in the master bedroom downstairs, and George and Marcia moved into their own guest rooms while we were downstairs. And every once in a while there'd be a knock on the door, and Marcia would say, I just want to get something out of the closet, and she'd come in and she'd get something out. But they couldn't have been nicer. They couldn't have been, sweeter and more generous. And it was just a great, very wonderful human-to-human experience.
Mm-hmm. And it always bugs me when people, talk about George in such a way where it makes him feel just like he's very, obviously he's a private person, he's not going around doing interviews all the time, but he's not a person that's gonna like shun you. At least from what I've seen with him, he's always been very generous with fans and people he's come into contact with. And from reading your book, it that rings true. Do you still keep in touch with him?
No, I don't. No? I think George is a bit of an introvert too.
Yeah.
He's not someone who I don't think he particularly enjoys the limelight.
Right.
But he's a very, very unusual person. There are very few people who have the artistic vision that he has, and also the business acumen that he has.
Right.
Usually it's either one or the other in someone, and very few people combine the two. And he's a smart cookie.
Oh yeah, definitely. And now sort of getting back to the book overall and just your career. Is there any one film that either you were given an opportunity to work on that you ultimately passed on that you wish, man, I wish I wouldn't have passed on that? Or is there a film that you wish you would have been approached to work on?
Well, I always wanted to work with Spielberg. I think that would have been really fun. I thought he and I always got along very well. And he offered me Close Encounters, but I was working on Carrie at the time. And I had it down. And then he hooked up with Michael Kahn, and that was it for,
Yeah.
Michael cut all his movies except for E.T. When he missed out on E.T., he swore he would never miss out on another picture for Steven. So.
Right. Yeah.
So Mike, but I would have liked to work with Steven. I think that would have been fun. Mm-hmm. I think he's a fantastically gifted director. And then I took a picture that I regretted. I worked on a picture called Righteous Kill. And turned down the Hurt Locker. And,
wow.
I would have liked to work on the Hurt Locker.
Yeah. I think that one ended up winning Best Picture, if I'm not mistaken.
It won Best Editor too.
Best Editor, yeah. There you go. So that's really interesting. Sort of being there in the heyday of George and Steven and Star Wars, Jaws, then Raiders in the early '80s. And this is just now. For my own personal enjoyment, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, I have to ask you a couple questions because that is still to this day probably in my top 3 favorite comedies ever. And my dad and I, we watch it every year around Thanksgiving.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to ask you, what was like, while you were cutting the movie, which joke did you just find yourself completely on the floor laughing and almost to the point of, I don't know if I can keep cutting this. I'm just laughing too much.
Well, there were several that are not in the movie.
Oh, okay.
Well, first, I have to ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
What about Ferris? Do you not count Ferris? I mean, what I hear from most people is Ferris Bueller's Day Off before they talk about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. That's the one I hear about more from people.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
See, I don't think I've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off as much. And I think it's just because Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is probably played more often in my house. And, although I love Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I mean, I think it's a fantastic movie. But for whatever reason...
I'm just curious. That's the one I hear about more than Planes and, PTA.
Yeah.
And then my other question was, have you ever seen it in a theater with an audience?
No, but I really want to because I
It's
feel
a
like
whole,
it would
it's a
get
whole other experience. Let me tell you,
yeah, yeah,
it really is.
yeah.
It's
One
it's not
one right.
it's not like watching it at home.
One scene that I've always thought, how it would play in the theater. One is obviously when Dell and Neil wake up in bed, and then
Yeah.
he's like, "Where's your other hand?" Between two pillows, and then they just freak out. That scene, and also the one in the airport. I can't tell you how often I reference that scene. Anytime we're on a trip, and I'm like, "Oh, we have to rent a car," I'm like, "Please do not pull uh, a Neil page at the rent a car counter."
Okay.
Um,
Well, there are two things that made me laugh till I couldn't breathe.
yeah.
One is in the first airport sequence. We cut it out,
Oh,
and it
okay.
was a shot of Candy and Steve have raced to the airport, and they find out the flight is canceled. Flight is delayed.
Hmm.
So they're sitting there waiting for the plane to take off, and um, Steve spots Candy, recognizes him, and they get into a conversation. And
Yeah.
Candy says, "Can I get you anything? Would you like something? Get some water." He offers him this stuff. He
Yeah.
turns everything. Well, in the dailies, he offered him about 50 things in a row. They
Oh
were
my
like,
gosh.
water, no. Orange juice, no thanks. Diet Coke, no thanks. Tea, coffee, jujubes, red
Oh
dots,
my gosh.
red vines,
Yeah.
good and plenty. He kept going. So
Right.
so that was pretty. We had to cut that out. And then um, the thing that really got me was Steve is sitting there. And he looks up, and Candy has got a cigarette in one hand
Hmm.
and an enormous chili dog in the other.
Hmm.
And he takes a drag on the cigarette, takes in a big lungful of smoke, and then he bites into the chili dog, and he's blowing the smoke out his nostrils.
Oh my gosh. I wish that was in the movie.
Uh,
Oh, that is amazing.
I almost died, and we
Oh,
had
that's
that. It was really funny. And then I forget what's in the movie and what's not because there's
yeah.
so much. One of the beans from the chili lands on his chest, and he flicks it off with his finger. He's aiming for
Yeah.
the wastebasket over there, and he says, "I'll take
Oh.
a mulligan on that one." So anyway, there was that, and then
Yeah.
in the motel scene, uh, they're lying in bed the night before, and uh, they're settling in and everything,
Right.
and Candy says, "Neil, you know anything about mining?" He says, "What?" He says, "You know anything about mining, coal mining? You know how coal miners, when they go down in the mines, there's always danger of poisonous gas leak, and they have these canaries that they take into the mine, and as long as the canary's singing, it's okay. But if there's a gas leak of some kind,
Yeah.
then the canary will die, and they'll know there's a problem." He says, "Yeah." He says, "Well," he says, "imagine that we had a canary in bed with us, a cage, and we have a canary named Petey. Petey's in the cage, with us in bed." He says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, Petey just died."
Oh my gosh. Oh, these
And,
are great.
and he throws off the covers. There's a whole scene,
Yeah, yeah.
So I didn't understand where he was going with this, and I'm thinking, what's he talking about, And then when I finally figured out where he was going with
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, I was listening to that chapter the other day, and you mentioned you guys had to cut, I think, like 28 days worth of shooting because the initial
Yeah,
cut was like almost 4 hours long.
yeah.
So I can just imagine the amount of jokes
So
that were
you
in there
listened
that
to the
had to.
book?
Yeah, yeah.
You didn't read it. You listened to it.
I listened to it. I think because the delivered date for the book, since with COVID-19 and everything, I think it would have gotten here after today. so I
Oh,
wouldn't
I
have
see.
been able to read it in time. Yeah.
Oh, oh. How was the reader?
Oh, he was fantastic.
Oh,
He was
good.
really fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, it was very easy listening, and it was really it flew by. I think the runtime on it was around 15, 16 hours.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, but it was really, really easy listening. The narrator did a great
Well,
job.
his voice is very different from mine, as you can hear.
Yeah. But luckily, before I was prepping for this, I was listening to a bunch of interviews you'd given, and sort of got the feel of how this would go. So, Paul,
Yes.
it's been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show today and talk about Star Wars as well as planes, trains, and automobiles. So, just wanted to say thank you. And before I let you go, where can
Yeah.
people find the book? And is there anything you want to say about the book to get more people to give it a shot and open it?
Well, the book is available on Amazon
Hmm.
and also on the Barnes and Noble website. It's on Audible, as you know. Um, um, I think it's also on the Chicago Review Press website. You can order it directly from the publisher.
Okay.
And Monday is Star Wars Day, May the
Yes, it
4th.
is.
So for May the 4th be with you, um, it's a book that, as David can attest, it's fun, it's easy to read, and with people stuck at home, I don't want to seem to be taking advantage of a terrible situation that we're in now, but
Yeah.
anyway, with people, if you want looking for a book to read to pass the time, something to get your mind off current events.
Hmm.
This is definitely kind of escapist, fun kind of book to read, and you might pick up a few tips about editing if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, well, there you guys have it. Make sure to go out and get the book. It is called A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away. Again, it is absolutely fantastic. You can order it and read it, or you can buy it on Audible and listen to it. Either way, it's absolutely fantastic. So, um,
Thank you.
thank you, Paul, again for coming on. And this episode is actually going to be coming out on May the 4th. So this will be a little treat for everybody
Excellent.
today now on May the 4th, and recording this about a few days beforehand. So hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. And right now we have, along with this episode with Paul, we have an interview with VFX legend Richard Edlund, who also worked on the original trilogy. That's already out. Great conversation with him. And we have our commentary for The Rise of Skywalker has already come out, so you guys can go and listen to that. And then we have new episodes coming out every Monday. So once again, thank you, Paul, for joining us, and thank you, everyone at home, for listening. And until next time, may the Force be with you, always.